The day had started like any other family gathering, with the familiar hum of conversation, the soft clinking of glasses, and the faint scent of freshly baked pastries drifting through the elegantly decorated hall. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Smiles, laughter, polite exchanges, but beneath that surface, tension had been quietly simmering for months. A slow building storm no one had fully noticed until it erupted in the most shocking and unexpected way. I had always tried to maintain a respectful relationship with my daughter-in-law, despite her subtle condescension and constant attempts to undermine me. For years, I had endured whispered criticisms about my home, my clothes, my car, and even the way I conducted myself in social settings. At first, I brushed them off, attributing her comments to youthful ignorance or simple misunderstandings. I reminded myself that marriage often brings challenges in adjusting to new family dynamics, that perhaps she would mellow over time. But deep down, a nagging feeling had always told me that her behavior was calculated, a deliberate attempt to assert dominance over me and my place in the family. That feeling, once faint, had grown steadily over the past year, transforming into a silent anxiety every time we were in the same room. And then it happened. In a single, violent motion, my daughter-in-law, who had always worn a mask of politeness in public, removed it entirely. Her hand struck my face with a sharpness and precision that I had never anticipated. The sound of the slap reverberated through the room like a crack of thunder, immediately silencing the crowd. My cheek burned, a deep, stinging pain that quickly spread down to my jaw, and my glasses flew from my face, smashing into pieces on the polished marble floor. I stumbled backward, my balance faltering as shock flooded my mind. For a fleeting moment, I could barely process what had just occurred. Hundreds of eyes were on me, some wide with disbelief, some shifting uncomfortably away, but no one stepped forward. The room had transformed into a theater of judgment, with myself cast unwillingly as the protagonist of a humiliating spectacle. Guests murmured among themselves in hushed tones, whispers growing into a low hum of speculation and sympathy, yet no action came to my aid. In that instant, I realized that this was no ordinary conflict. This was a carefully orchestrated display of power, aimed not just at taking the keys to my apartment, but at publicly undermining my authority, my dignity, and my very sense of self. The audacity of her actions left me reeling. "Give me the keys to your apartment," she screamed, her voice cutting through the stunned silence with a piercing clarity that left no room for debate. The demand was bold, unapologetic, and utterly disrespectful, delivered as though it were a rightful claim rather than an outrageous request. I felt a surge of emotions in rapid succession: disbelief, anger, hurt, and even the twinge of fear. How could she confront me so brazenly in front of everyone, without even a trace of hesitation or remorse? I looked around, hoping to find a familiar face, a protective glance from my son, my friends, or relatives. But all I found were eyes wide with disbelief, some sympathetic, others silently judging. My son, Ethan, who I had believed would defend me instinctively, stood frozen, his gaze fixed firmly on the ground. His inaction was a silent betrayal, a tacit acknowledgement that he would not interfere to protect me from his wife's assault. The emotional impact of his passivity struck me as profoundly as the slap itself, revealing that the confrontation was not simply between my daughter-in-law and me. It was a deeper conflict, one that exposed fractures in familial loyalty, trust, and respect. I crouched to gather the shattered remnants of my glasses, each fragment a symbolic representation of my dignity, momentarily scattered and broken before me. My hands shook, betraying the calm I struggled to maintain, and my chest tightened with a mixture of embarrassment and fury. The guests' eyes followed my every move. Some averted, some stared, but no one intervened. Their collective silence created a weight that pressed upon me, amplifying the sense of isolation that Juliet had engineered with meticulous precision. She had always been observant, calculating, and manipulative, But witnessing the culmination of her tactics in this public display made it painfully clear that her goal extended far beyond the apartment keys. She sought to dominate, to humiliate, and to establish herself as the unquestioned authority in the room, regardless of social conventions or familial bonds. Every element of her demeanor, the poised posture, the deliberate calm in her voice, the slight smirk that hinted at satisfaction, was a clear signal that she believed she had won. But as I steadied myself, a different feeling began to stir beneath the shock. Amid the sting of the slap, the humiliation, and the sense of betrayal by my own son, a quiet, simmering determination began to form. It was as if the universe had drawn a line, signaling that the time for passivity had ended. The act of aggression, meant to break me, instead ignited a resolve that had lain dormant for years. In that moment, I realized something crucial. The physical blow, as sharp as it was less significant than the emotional power it had given me, the power to reclaim my dignity, to strategize, and to respond in a way that no one, not even Juliet, could anticipate. The audience, whether present in the room or witnessing the story later through video, senses this pivotal moment, feeling both the tension of the conflict and the anticipation of what comes next. This blend of immediate shock, public humiliation, and the protagonist's emerging strength creates a compelling, emotionally charged narrative hook that compels viewers to stay engaged, eager to see how the underestimated mother-in-law will reclaim her space, her authority, and her respect in the face of audacious defiance. The room remained tense. Every whisper, every glance contributed to a crescendo of anticipation. The polished marble reflected not only the broken pieces of my glasses, but the fractured dynamics of the family around me. In that instant, the scene transcended a simple act of aggression. It became a study of power, control, and the fragile veneer of civility that can shatter in a heartbeat. I could see the reactions, some faces contorted with disbelief, some with subtle pity, and others with curiosity, each adding to the emotional resonance of the moment. Juliet believed she had orchestrated the perfect display of dominance, but in doing so, she had also revealed her overconfidence, her lack of awareness of the depth of my character. This moment, this initial slap and demand for my keys, was not the end. It was merely the ignition, the opening act in a narrative that would soon unveil layers of hidden strength, strategic cunning, and eventual reckoning. It was the first domino, and as I slowly straightened, my pulse steadying, I knew the story was far from over. As the echo of the slap slowly faded into an uncomfortable hush, Juliet, my daughter-in-law, did not waver. Instead, she took deliberate steps to assert her dominance, moving closer with the poise and confidence of someone who believed the room belonged to her alone. Her eyes, sharp and unwavering, scanned the crowd, ensuring that every guest understood the full scope of her audacity. "A woman your age doesn't need so much space," she began, her voice firm yet deceptively calm, the kind of tone that masks cruelty beneath the guise of practicality. "Ethan and I need privacy, and your apartment will be perfect for us while we search for something bigger." Each word she spoke was carefully calculated, meant to wound, intimidate, and make me appear unreasonable or selfish. The statement was not simply about physical space. It was an assertion of control, a psychological maneuver designed to strip me of dignity while positioning herself as the rational, rightful authority. It was a tactic I had witnessed before, in subtle forms: a raised eyebrow during family dinners, thinly veiled comments about my home, my belongings, my modest lifestyle. But now all of her manipulations had coalesced into a single explosive moment that left the entire room frozen in disbelief. The audience of guests became an unwilling chorus, their reactions adding layers to the tension. Some whispered discreetly to one another, casting glances in my direction with expressions of sympathy, but they did not intervene. Others pretended to be absorbed in unrelated conversations, eyes flicking occasionally toward the drama, but never committing to a response. The social pressure to remain neutral or avoid confrontation played perfectly into Juliet's hands, amplifying the isolation and humiliation I felt. Meanwhile, my son, Ethan, remained immobilized, as though he were paralyzed by shock or fear, unable to step forward and defend me. His silence cut deeper than the slap itself, signaling not only a failure of loyalty, but also an implicit agreement with the daughter-in-law's actions. It was clear that Juliet had mastered not only the art of psychological dominance over me, but also the subtle manipulation of her husband, ensuring that her public display of power went unchallenged. For the guests, this created a complex emotional tableau: pity for me, admiration for her assertiveness, and perhaps even a grudging acknowledgement of her audacity. For me, it was a perfect storm of anger, humiliation, and the realization that my response would have to be measured, strategic, and ultimately decisive. As she continued to speak, each sentence became a weapon, meticulously crafted to undermine my confidence and assert authority over both the physical space of the apartment and the perception of my character. Her words were laced with subtle accusations. Her calm tone only made them sting sharply. "You've had this apartment for long enough," she said, her smile almost imperceptible but undeniably cruel. "It's time for new energy. We deserve to start our life without interference, without the burden of your old ways." Every phrase carried the weight of judgment and entitlement, painting me as outdated, selfish, and stubborn. As I stood there, trembling yet trying to maintain composure, memories of the past few years began to flood my mind, each one a small dagger that Juliet had slowly and deliberately driven into my sense of self. The slap, shocking as it was, did not emerge from nowhere. It was the culmination of countless subtle humiliations, manipulations, and condescending remarks that had built over time. I recalled the very first time she visited my modest apartment, the place I had nurtured and cherished for decades. Her face had fallen almost instantly, her expression betraying a silent judgment as she took in the worn furniture, the simple decor, and the carefully maintained cleanliness that spoke not of poverty, but of my values: practicality, order, and comfort. She had whispered under her breath, just loud enough for my ears to catch, "Seriously? This is where Ethan's mother lives?" The comment, though seemingly small, carried a venom that stung and lingered in the back of my mind long after the visit ended. I had chosen to ignore it at the time, convincing myself it was a passing remark, but it was a harbinger of the relentless psychological games that were to come. Over the months, her subtle jabs had escalated with alarming consistency. First, it was about my wardrobe, her eyes scanning my clothes with thinly veiled disapproval. "Aurora, don't you have anything more modern to wear?" she would ask, her tone almost casual, but dripping with judgment. Then came remarks about my old, reliable car. "That car is so outdated and unsafe. Why are you still driving it?" Even my part-time work at the local flower shop, which brought me peace and modest income, became a target. "Why are you still working at your age? You should be enjoying life instead of dealing with flowers all day," she would remark with a smile that never reached her eyes. Each of these insults was minor on its own, easily dismissible to an outsider, but together they formed a slow, persistent erosion of my confidence, a calculated campaign to convince me, and perhaps even my own son, that I was outdated, weak, and unworthy of respect. Every dinner, every casual conversation, every family gathering became a battlefield where I had to endure her subtle, cutting barbs while maintaining a veneer of calm. The psychological weight of these accumulated humiliations became almost unbearable over time, and yet I had always held on to one quiet truth. The life I projected to the world, the modest widow with a simple apartment, was only one layer of my story. Behind the carefully curated image of humility lay decades of experience, resilience, and resources that Juliet had never suspected. For years, I had consciously chosen a life of discretion, living simply not out of necessity, but out of principle. My late husband and I had built a secure life, one that allowed us to maintain privacy and independence, far from the prying eyes of distant relatives, judgmental neighbors, or opportunistic family members. That life, that hidden strength, had remained invisible, carefully tucked beneath layers of simplicity that the world and Juliet had been all too eager to underestimate. As I crouched to gather the shattered pieces of my glasses, my mind replayed every insult, every moment of condescension, every quiet attempt to undermine my authority. The room around me had become a stage, the guests unwitting actors in a drama crafted by Juliet's arrogance. Some whispered pityingly, others pretended ignorance, but all were now witnesses to the undeniable injustice unfolding before them. My son's frozen stance, a mixture of shock and helplessness, only heightened the tension. His inaction had inadvertently reinforced Juliet's power in the moment, but it also ignited a spark within me, a determination to reclaim the respect and dignity that had been so casually stripped away. I could feel the emotional shift taking place, a transformation from stunned victim to quietly calculating strategist. I understood with sudden clarity that this slap was not just an act of cruelty, it was the catalyst that would push me into action, the moment that would reveal the true depth of my character to the world. The audience, whether present in the room or later watching the story unfold through video, is drawn into this emotional narrative because it mirrors a universal experience. Being underestimated, belittled, or humiliated by someone younger, more assertive, or seemingly more powerful. Every whispered insult, every judgmental glance, every condescending remark from the past serves to heighten empathy, to make viewers not just witness the injustice, but feel it viscerally. By the time the narrative reaches this point, the groundwork has been laid for a powerful twist. The revelation that I am far from powerless, that the image of vulnerability and meekness I have carefully cultivated is precisely what allows me to act with strategy, discretion, and surprising force. The tension, built meticulously over years of subtle disrespect, now converges into a single, emotionally charged moment that promises both catharsis and drama. In this context, the slap ceases to be a mere act of aggression. It becomes symbolic, a turning point where the protagonist's previously hidden strength begins to surface. The audience senses it instinctively, the quiet simmering beneath the surface, the mental calculations forming even as I appear composed, the subtle shift from fear to determination. The scene is crafted to maximize engagement, to draw viewers into a roller coaster of emotions. Anger at the injustice, pity for the humiliation, suspense over the unseen plans, and anticipation for the eventual reversal that will inevitably come. This emotional layering ensures that viewers are not merely passive observers. They are invested in the outcome, rooting for the protagonist's redemption and the inevitable consequences that the audacious daughter-in-law will inevitably face. Every glance, every whispered comment from the guests, every frozen expression of my son adds to the emotional richness, creating a narrative tapestry that is as compelling as it is relatable. Even as I straighten, collecting the last fragments of my broken glasses, the air remains thick with tension. The subtle contrast between Juliet's poised confidence and my outward calm belies the storm brewing within me, a storm of determination, resilience, and quiet strategy. This emotional and psychological complexity is the hallmark of viral storytelling. It creates empathy, suspense, and anticipation all at once, ensuring that viewers remain glued to the narrative, hungry for the resolution that promises both justice and revelation.
The story, though rooted in a singular event, resonates broadly because it speaks to fundamental human experiences, being underestimated, enduring humiliation, and ultimately reclaiming dignity and power. And so the stage is set, not only for the confrontation in that room, but for a journey that will reveal the true depth of my character, the hidden strengths that have been underestimated for too long, and the inevitable reckoning that will follow.
As I tried to regain my composure, a sinking feeling settled deep within me, one that was heavier and more painful than the sting on my cheek. My son, Ethan, the man I had nurtured and guided since birth, the one whose loyalty I had always believed unshakable, remained frozen. His eyes were cast downward, firmly fixed on the floor, as though my humiliation were invisible, as though I did not exist in that moment. His silence, more than the slap itself, cut through me like a jagged blade. It was a betrayal that I had never anticipated, a fracture in the very foundation of my family that I had thought unbreakable. All those years of love, support, and guidance suddenly seemed fragile, teetering on the edge of disillusionment. I realized in that instant that Juliet had mastered not only the art of outward confrontation, but the subtler, far more insidious skill of psychological manipulation, controlling not just my reactions, but also bending her husband to her will. The room around us, once filled with polite conversation, laughter, and the hum of celebratory chatter, now felt suffocating. Guests shifted in their seats, exchanging glances that were a mixture of shock, curiosity, and silent judgment. Some covered their mouths in disbelief, unsure whether to intervene. Others whispered quietly, their words floating like distant echoes I could barely hear. There was a tension in the air, a thick, almost tangible pressure, as if everyone present were holding their breath, waiting for the next move, waiting for someone to break the uncomfortable stalemate. Yet no one stepped forward. Their hesitance reinforced the isolation I felt, amplifying the sense of vulnerability that Juliet had so meticulously engineered. Every second that passed seemed to stretch endlessly, each heartbeat thundering in my chest, as I realized that the confrontation was no longer merely a clash over property or pride. It had escalated into a public test of loyalty, courage, and familial bonds. Ethan's inaction spoke volumes. His inability, or unwillingness, to defend me added a layer of betrayal that cut deeper than the physical blow I had endured moments earlier. I had always imagined that he would instinctively step in, that he would recognize the injustice before him and act to protect me. Instead, he remained immobile, a silent observer, his body language radiating discomfort, fear, and perhaps even complicity. It was as if he were trapped in the gravitational pull of Juliet's dominance, unable to assert his own agency or challenge her. The emotional impact of this realization was staggering. I felt my heart tighten, my stomach churn, and a wave of anger rise within me. The slap, the demands, and the humiliation were painful enough, but the profound sense of abandonment from my own child was almost unbearable. It was a betrayal that reshaped the entire narrative, turning a simple family dispute into a complex web of loyalty, manipulation, and power dynamics. Despite the shock and hurt, a spark of clarity began to emerge within me. I understood, in that pivotal moment, that my son's paralysis was not just a weakness, but also an opportunity. The audience, whether in the room or later watching through a video, senses this complex emotional interplay: the pain of betrayal, the shock of public humiliation, and the simmering strength hidden beneath the surface. Viewers are drawn into the narrative because they recognize the injustice, empathize with the protagonist, and anticipate the eventual reversal. This is a critical point in the story. The mother-in-law, previously underestimated,
begins to recognize the power dynamics at play and the potential for strategic action. The realization that her son is not coming to her aid forces her to think, plan, and ultimately reclaim control in a way that is both calculated and satisfying to the audience. Juliet, observing the immobility of her husband and the uncertainty of the guests, smirked subtly, her body language radiating triumph. She believed she had achieved total control over me, over Ethan, and over the perception of everyone present. Her smile was almost imperceptible, but unmistakably self-satisfied, a silent declaration that she had won the first round of this conflict. She had created a scene in which I appeared weak, vulnerable, and entirely dependent on the approval or intervention of others. But the very arrogance she displayed revealed her blind spots. She underestimated my resilience, my years of experience navigating complex situations, and the depth of strategy and discretion I had cultivated over decades. In that brief exchange of glances, I understood that this public humiliation, while excruciating, was also a turning point, the moment that would catalyze my transformation from a passive target into a quietly formidable force. I straightened my posture, careful not to let the tremor in my hands betray the storm of emotions inside me. Every broken piece of my glasses I picked up symbolized a fragment of my dignity, temporarily shattered but not destroyed. I could feel the eyes of the guests on me, some sympathetic, some curious, and others silently critical. Yet beneath the surface, a slow-burning determination began to root take. Juliet had assumed that the combination of public display, psychological intimidation, and my son's silence would render me powerless. But the truth was far more complex. I was not merely a victim. I was a strategist, a woman who had lived decades cultivating patience, foresight, and an understanding of human behavior. The narrative, once framed as one of humiliation, was beginning to shift. The audience senses this subtle change, the undercurrent of hidden strength emerging from a seemingly fragile figure. This paragraph, like the unfolding story, is layered with tension and emotional stakes. The audience feels the weight of betrayal, the injustice of the public display, and the anticipation of retribution. The son's silence is a masterstroke in storytelling, highlighting both the protagonist's isolation and the antagonist's overconfidence. Every micro-expression, every glance, and every whisper in the room serves to heighten suspense and build empathy. By the end of this moment, viewers are fully invested, not just in the immediate conflict over the apartment keys, but in the larger arc of justice, strategy, and the eventual reclamation of dignity. The stage is set for the protagonist to reveal her hidden power, her calculated response, and the inevitable reversal that will upend Juliet's perceived victory, ensuring that the story maintains a compelling, viral quality that keeps audiences hooked from start to finish.
The ballroom, once alive with laughter and the subtle hum of celebration, had transformed into a theater of judgment and tension, a place where every movement and glance carried weight far beyond the celebratory intentions of the day. The guests, hundreds of them, were frozen in a collective, almost reverent silence, unsure whether to intervene, speak, or simply turn away. The shattered pieces of my glasses lay scattered on the marble floor, glinting under the soft, ambient lighting, each fragment catching and reflecting not only the room's golden chandeliers, but also the fractured dignity of the moment. Some of the onlookers whispered to one another, exchanging glances that betrayed their disbelief and discomfort. Their murmurs floated through the air, an undercurrent of speculation, pity, and judgment. Yet, no one stepped forward to intervene, as if afraid to challenge the audacious display of power orchestrated by my daughter-in-law. In that instant, I felt the full weight of isolation, a profound loneliness that compounded the physical sting of the slab and the emotional ache of my son's silence. Every whispered word, every diverted gaze seemed to amplify the spectacle, turning me into the unwilling centerpiece of a public trial in which I had no voice. Juliet, sensing the effect of her actions, moved through the room with calculated grace, her posture commanding attention, her face composed in a serene but menacing mask. "Ethan and I need our space," she continued, her voice cutting through the stillness like a knife, "and your apartment will make this transition seamless." The audacity of her words was breathtaking, delivered not in anger, but in the icy calm of someone who believes herself entirely justified. Her presence dominated the room, her aura demanding submission, compliance, or at the very least, acquiescence. Every gesture, every tilt of her head was imbued with the subtle arrogance of someone confident in their victory. And yet, beneath the polished exterior, there were cracks only I could perceive. Overconfidence, impatience, and the assumption that her control was absolute. These imperfections, invisible to most of the room, were my first glimpse of opportunity, the seed of the strategy that would eventually restore my dignity and turn the tables on her audacious claim. The guests' reactions were as telling as Juliet's words. Some shifted in their seats, casting sympathetic looks in my direction, while others seemed transfixed, unsure how to react without breaching social etiquette. Each pair of eyes carried its own story: curiosity, discomfort, silent judgment, or even subtle approval of her actions. The tension created by these varied reactions was almost palpable, a tangible presence that weighed heavily on my chest. It was as if the room itself had become a character in the drama, responding to the conflict in a collective emotional pulse. I could feel the stares, the whispers, the quiet gasps, each one fueling both my humiliation and the burgeoning determination within me. For a fleeting moment, I felt vulnerable, exposed, and powerless, but only for a moment. Deep within, a spark ignited. The realization that this public stage, meant to demonstrate my subjugation, could instead become the arena in which my hidden strength would be revealed. The visual contrast of the scene heightened the emotional intensity. Juliet, radiant in her pristine wedding gown, epitomized control, confidence, and poise, while I, crouched to pick up my broken glasses, appeared fragile, vulnerable, and momentarily defeated. The disparity between her composed figure and my trembling form played out like a cinematic tableau, every detail conspiring to underscore the dramatic tension. Yet beneath the surface of vulnerability, I felt a quiet resilience building, a mental preparation that the audience could intuitively sense. This is a crucial element for virality. Viewers are emotionally drawn to the contrast between perceived weakness and hidden power, eagerly anticipating the moment when the underestimated figure will reveal their true capabilities. Every subtle glance, every whisper among the guests, every flicker of doubt or admiration in their eyes contributed to the layered tension that gripped the room, ensuring that the narrative remained compelling and impossible to ignore. Even as my heart raced, I became acutely aware of the stakes. This was more than a personal affront. It was a challenge to my authority, my legacy, and the respect I had painstakingly cultivated over decades. Every insult Juliet had delivered over the years, every subtle slight, every thinly veiled judgment, now converged in this single electrifying moment. The slap was merely the catalyst. The audience, the room, and the public nature of the confrontation magnified its impact. Each whisper, each judgmental glance, and each moment of hesitation among the guests added to the tension, creating a narrative that was both intimate and universally relatable. Viewers watching would feel the weight of social pressure, the sting of betrayal, and the simmering potential for a strategic response that promised eventual vindication. I straightened, slowly rising to my full height, aware that every movement was being scrutinized. The trembling in my hands persisted, but my expression began to mask the fear and hurt, revealing only composure and quiet determination. The broken glasses I held in my hand became symbolic, an emblem of both the humiliation I had endured and the resolve that was now solidifying within me. I knew, in that moment, that the story was far from over. Juliet's public display of power had created a spectacle, yes, but it had also inadvertently set the stage for her own downfall. Every detail, from the shocked silence of the guests to my son's immobilized stance, contributed to a narrative arc ripe for suspense, drama, and eventual reversal.
As the minutes stretched, the room seemed to contract around me, every gaze and whisper amplifying the emotional stakes. Some guests began to murmur quietly about my age, my ability to maintain my home, and the audacity of the daughter-in-law. Others speculated about the possible fallout, questioning whether I would retaliate, defend myself, or simply retreat. This mixture of intrigue, sympathy, and judgment created a perfect storm of engagement, ensuring that the narrative would resonate with anyone who had ever been underestimated, belittled, or humiliated. The tension was deliberate, palpable, and expertly layered, drawing the audience into the drama while subtly foreshadowing the eventual reversal that was already beginning to take shape in my mind. Juliet, oblivious to the internal storm brewing within me, continued to radiate confidence, believing herself untouchable. But as I looked around the room, I could see the subtle shifts in perception, the fleeting looks of curiosity, the cautious glances, the whispers that hinted at doubt in her absolute control. In these subtle cues lay the beginnings of opportunity, a crack in her armor that I would soon exploit. The story once framed as my public humiliation was now evolving into a suspenseful narrative of strategy, patience, and hidden strength, designed to captivate and emotionally. As the whispers and murmurs swirled around the ballroom, I felt a peculiar shift within myself, a subtle yet profound transformation that seemed to gather force with every second that passed. The initial shock of the slap, the sting of humiliation, and the pang of betrayal from my own son, Ethan, were now interwoven with a rising awareness. This moment, as agonizing as it was, could be transformed into an opportunity. I had always been underestimated, both by my family and by the world at large. My modest lifestyle, simple wardrobe, and the small, quiet apartment I called home had convinced many, including Juliet, that I was fragile, compliant, and easily manipulated. Yet the truth, hidden beneath decades of carefully cultivated discretion, was the exact opposite. I was not a woman to be dismissed, ignored, or publicly humiliated without consequence. This realization, crystallizing with clarity in the midst of the chaos, was like the ignition of a long-dormant fire. Juliet, completely absorbed in her apparent victory, continued her poised domination of the space, unaware that she had misjudged me completely. She had assumed that the combination of public attention, social pressure, and my son's inaction would render me powerless, yet she had overlooked one fundamental fact. I had patience, strategy, and experience that no amount of arrogance or manipulation could ever erase. Her confidence, while impressive on the surface, revealed her blind spots, overconfidence and impatience, that were her undoing. As I observed her, smoothing the folds of her immaculate gown and delivering each cutting remark with precision, I began to notice the cracks in her carefully constructed facade. The subtle flicker of irritation in her eyes, the tension in her jaw, and the fleeting hesitations in her voice, all were invisible to the casual observer, but screamed opportunity to someone who knew where to look. Every outward sign of control she displayed was in reality an intricate dance masking uncertainty, and I was now fully aware that this moment was not just a challenge, but a stage on which I could reclaim power. As I straightened, holding the shattered remains of my glasses with a trembling hand, a sense of calm determination began to replace the initial shock. The physical sting on my cheek had faded into a dull ache, overshadowed by a growing clarity of thought. I realized that every element of Juliet's behavior, every whisper among the guests, and every moment of my son's frozen indecision were part of a broader narrative that I could now influence. My mind began to run through possibilities, strategies, and contingencies. I could respond impulsively and let anger guide my actions, but I knew that would only play into her hands. Instead, I resolved to act with measured precision, leveraging the audience's perceptions, the social dynamics at play, and the very arrogance of my daughter-in-law to orchestrate a reversal that would be as dramatic and unforgettable as the humiliation I had just endured. This was not merely about the apartment keys. It was about reclaiming dignity, asserting authority, and demonstrating that my perceived vulnerability was nothing more than a carefully maintained illusion. The guests, sensing both the tension and the potential for resolution, became an active part of the emotional landscape. Some leaned forward in their seats, curiosity and suspense etched across their faces. Others exchanged cautious glances, subtly evaluating the power dynamics unfolding before them. The silence in the room, once oppressive and suffocating, now seemed pregnant with possibility. Each heartbeat, each rustle of clothing, and each whispered exchange contributed to a crescendo of anticipation that even Juliet could not fully control. She had assumed that her public display of dominance would render the story predictable and one-sided, yet the narrative was already shifting in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The audience, whether consciously or subconsciously, sensed that a turning point was approaching, a moment when the underestimated figure, the quiet, modest, and seemingly powerless mother-in-law, would reveal depths of strength and strategy previously hidden from view. I reflected on the history of my interactions with Juliet, recognizing patterns of manipulation, arrogance, and psychological games that had escalated over the years. Each remark about my clothing, my car, my lifestyle, and even my career had been a calculated effort to chip away at my confidence and create a sense of dependency. She had underestimated the resilience that decades of life experience had instilled in me. Every subtle condescension, every whispered criticism, and every moment of public discomfort had been a test I had survived with quiet grace. That history, once a source of cumulative pain, now became a source of insight. I could anticipate her next moves, predict her strategies, and prepare a response that would not only restore my dignity, but also shift the balance of power entirely. This mental clarity, born from both experience and observation, was the turning point that transformed the scene from one of helplessness to one of tactical potential. The sense of personal empowerment, quietly gathering momentum, was amplified by the reactions of the guests. Their whispers, glances, and subtle expressions of curiosity and doubt were no longer oppressive. Instead, they became tools I could harness. I understood that perception was as powerful as action in this scenario. The more the audience sensed my resolution, the more they would question Juliet's unchallenged dominance. Every micro-expression, a flicker of uncertainty, a subtle hesitation would work in my favor. The ballroom, once a stage for humiliation, was now an arena of strategy, observation, and psychological maneuvering. I could almost see the narrative arc forming in real time. The audacious daughter-in-law asserting dominance, the son paralyzed by loyalty and fear, and the mother-in-law, underestimated and dismissed, quietly preparing a response that would redefine every expectation. In that charged, silent moment, I knew that the next steps were critical. I could not act recklessly, nor could I allow emotions to dictate my strategy. Precision, timing, and the careful management of appearances were essential. Juliet's overconfidence in public bravado had created a window, a rare and fleeting opportunity to assert control and reclaim authority. I resolved to use every advantage at my disposal: the social optics of the moment, the expectations of the audience, and the strategic silence of my son. The physical pain of the slap, the humiliation before the guests, and the emotional sting of betrayal had all served a purpose. They had revealed the true nature of my adversary and illuminated the path forward. By the time I straightened fully, with the shattered pieces of my glasses held carefully in my hand, I felt an unwavering sense of clarity. The initial shock and humiliation had evolved into a potent mix of awareness, strategy, and quiet determination. Juliet, still unaware of the depth of her miscalculation, continued to command attention with her polished composure, believing herself untouchable. But beneath the calm exterior, a carefully plotted response was already forming. The narrative had shifted. The story of humiliation was transforming into a story of resilience, strategy, and the eventual reversal of power. The audience, whether in the room or later watching through recording, could sense the shift, the subtle emergence of strength, intelligence, and tactical acumen in a figure who had been underestimated for decades. And in that charged, silent moment, I knew that the next act of this drama would be decisive, dramatic, and unforgettable.
Standing in the center of the ballroom, I realized that power doesn't always announce itself with volume or fury. Sometimes it manifests quietly, with deliberate precision and a patient mind. Juliet, still glowing in her pristine wedding gown, radiated confidence as if her slap had decisively shifted the balance in her favor. But I knew better. The room, though filled with curious and shocked eyes, could be turned into my stage, the witnesses into silent allies of perception, if only I carefully calibrated my first moves. Anger could be obvious, and tears, though natural, would only reinforce the image of fragility she intended to impose. Instead, I resolved to act with strategy, small, subtle, and calculated gestures that would unsettle her and shift the narrative, starting with the mere act of regaining composure in front of everyone. The first move in any confrontation of this scale is psychological dominance, and though it may be invisible to the untrained eye, the audience can feel its force. I straightened slowly, lifting my chin just enough to meet the eyes of a few guests, establishing a quiet, commanding presence. My broken glasses, which moments ago had symbolized my vulnerability, now rested in my hand like a prop, signaling endurance and strength. Every eye in the room could sense the change. Whispers hushed as curiosity and tension mingled. Juliet's poised composure, which had been so effective at first, now wavered ever so slightly. The first cracks in her armor were not loud or dramatic, but subtle, a flicker of hesitation in her smile, a slight tightening of her jaw, a momentary pause before she spoke. These micro-expressions were invisible to most, but to someone who had spent decades reading human behavior, they were glaring opportunities. I recognized that this moment was not about confrontation or spectacle. It was about reclaiming control, asserting my presence, and planting the seed of doubt in the mind of the person who believed she had won. I began speaking softly, deliberately projecting calm authority rather than anger. Juliet, I understand your desire for privacy and space, but you must also understand that respect and consideration are not optional. My words were measured, deliberate, and slow, ensuring that each syllable landed like a pebble in still water, sending ripples of subtle disruption. The guests, already captivated by the unfolding drama, could sense the controlled intensity in my voice. My tone, calm yet firm, contrasted sharply with the arrogance and aggression Juliet had displayed. It was a quiet, powerful demonstration that though I had been publicly humiliated, I was far from powerless. The beauty of subtle retaliation is that it undermines the aggressor's confidence without requiring overt confrontation. It forces them to rethink, to hesitate, and to reveal their weaknesses in response to patience and strategy. Juliet, momentarily caught off guard by my measured response, attempted to recover her dominance. She smoothed the folds of her gown, adjusting her posture as if to reassert control, and said, "Aurora, we're only asking for what's practical. You can't possibly need such a large apartment anymore. It's time to make space for the next generation." Her words, though intended to intimidate, now rang hollow. The guests, who had initially viewed her as the assertive figure in control, began to shift in perception. Subtle body language cues, the slight tightening of her shoulders, the almost imperceptible narrowing of her eyes, betrayed her rising uncertainty. By remaining composed, calm, and deliberate, I had begun to shift the psychological balance. The first move of retaliation does not need fireworks. It only requires awareness, patience, and the ability to exploit the cracks in your adversary's confidence. I could feel a quiet surge of energy as the room's attention subtly realigned. Guests, who had earlier looked at me with pity, now observed me with curiosity, some even admiration. Every glance, every whisper, every perceptible reaction became a thread in the web I was beginning to weave. In these small, almost invisible maneuvers, the groundwork for a larger reversal was being laid. Juliet's public display of strength had inadvertently exposed her own reliance on the perception of absolute control. She had assumed that her aggressiveness would dominate both me and the audience, but her overconfidence had become her blind spot. Small, controlled actions, raising my head, meeting eyes, speaking with calm authority, were the first strokes in painting a new narrative, that of the underestimated figure quietly reclaiming power. Even my son Ethan seemed to sense a subtle shift. Though he remained frozen, his gaze occasionally flickered toward me, a mixture of confusion, curiosity, and perhaps dawning realization. The paralysis that had held him, the loyalty that had rendered him immobile in the face of Juliet's audacity, was beginning to waver. Witnessing my composure, the audience's subtle shift, and Juliet's cracks, he began unconsciously reconsider the dynamics before him. Psychological retaliation is not only about the direct target, it often extends to those who support or witness the conflict. By reclaiming calm and projecting authority, I was sending a silent message. The story had not ended, and the balance of power was now contested. The final element of this initial retaliation was the use of perception. Guests in the room, many of whom had been passive observers, now became part of the tension. Some leaned forward slightly, intrigued by my calm and deliberate demeanor. Others exchanged glances, recognizing the subtle shift, the emerging courage and strategy of the woman they had assumed was fragile. The narrative was no longer one of simple humiliation. It was evolving into a story of resilience, intelligence, and the promise of an eventual, satisfying reversal. Every micro-expression I displayed, every controlled movement, every measured word added layers to this developing tension, ensuring that the psychological game was firmly in motion. By the time I finished my first measured statements, the room felt subtly different. Juliet, for all her confidence and composure, had lost the subtle advantage she thought was hers. Her attempts to maintain control were now juxtaposed against my calm and strategic presence, and the room's perception had begun to shift in my favor. The initial move of retaliation had been executed perfectly. No outward aggression, no rash action, just quiet, deliberate assertion of composure and strategic psychological pressure. The stage was set for the next phase, one that would escalate the tension, reveal deeper layers of strength, and begin the process of reclaiming the respect, authority, and control that had been challenged so publicly. The subtle groundwork I had laid in the previous moments was now beginning to pay off, though Juliet had yet to realize the shift. Her confidence, which had radiated so effortlessly just minutes ago, was starting to falter in ways almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. She continued to hold her head high, adjust her gown, and project an air of authority, but the tension in her posture betrayed a growing unease. Every small micro-expression, a flicker of doubt in her eyes, a tightened jaw, a brief pause before she spoke, was a crack in the armor she believed to be impenetrable. The ballroom, filled with 130 guests, had transformed from a festival celebration into a stage for a subtle yet powerful psychological confrontation. The audience, initially passive observers, now sensed the shift. Their whispers, glances, and reactions reflected a curiosity and intrigue that added weight to the tension. They were watching a contest of control, one that promised drama, suspense, and eventual resolution, even if they didn't yet understand the full stakes. I allowed myself a slow, deliberate breath.
steadying the storm of emotion inside me while projecting calm, deliberate composure outwardly. Each movement, each carefully measured gesture was a silent declaration. The humiliation of the slap and Juliet's audacious demand for my apartment keys had not defeated me. The broken glasses in my hand, the trembling that had initially betrayed vulnerability, all of it was now a carefully managed performance of quiet strength. The art of psychological strategy is subtle, relying on the perception of others as much as the reality of one's own power. Guests who had initially glanced at me with pity now watched with a heightened awareness, sensing that something significant was unfolding. They could feel the shift even before they could name it. The underestimated woman was no longer merely a victim, but a quiet force to be reckoned with. Juliet, sensing a subtle change in the atmosphere, attempted to regain her composure. She smoothed her gown, straightened her posture, and delivered her next statement with controlled grace. "Aurora, this isn't personal. We simply need the apartment to start our new life. Surely you can understand that." Her tone, calm and reasoned on the surface, betrayed the slightest edge of defensiveness. That edge, though minuscule, was all the opening I needed. Psychological power, especially in public confrontation, thrives on such tiny fissures. By remaining calm and composed, I was forcing her to reveal the cracks in her strategy, turning her confidence against her, without ever raising my voice or appearing aggressive. The audience, sensitive to these dynamics, felt the tension increase. Every whisper, every sideways glance, and every subtle shift in posture became part of the unfolding narrative, making them unwitting participants in the psychological duel. I chose my next words carefully, speaking slowly and deliberately, ensuring that the room hung on each phrase. "Juliet, respect and consideration are not optional, even when one believes they are entitled. You may want what belongs to me, but entitlement does not replace integrity." The calm firmness in my voice contrasted sharply with the aggression she had displayed moments before, creating a dissonance that unsettled her further. The guests, sensing the intensity and poise behind my words, began to shift their perception once again. They had initially seen her as the dominant figure, a woman asserting her will over a vulnerable elder. Now, they were starting to recognize the quiet authority in me, the resilience, the intelligence, and the strategic patience that had allowed me to remain composed in the face of open humiliation. Psychological strategy, I realized, is often about controlling perception as much as controlling events. The smallest gesture, a steady gaze, a deliberate pause, a brief pause before she spoke, can be as powerful as any physical action. Juliet's body language began to betray her growing unease. The stiffness in her shoulders increased, her hands moved slightly more than necessary as she had tried to adjust her gown, and her gaze occasionally flickered toward my son, searching for reassurance or support. Ethan remained hesitant, caught between loyalty to his mother and the dawning realization that his wife's aggressive tactics had not gone unnoticed. These subtle signals, almost invisible to anyone who was not paying close attention, were clear indicators that the balance of psychological power was slowly beginning to shift. Each micro-movement, each flicker of uncertainty, was a victory in the silent duel unfolding in the ballroom. The audience, absorbed by the tension, could sense the stakes and anticipated the next move, adding layers of engagement, suspense, and emotional investment. I continued to maintain an outward calm, aware that my next actions had to reinforce the perception of control while preparing the foundation for more decisive moves. I allowed my eyes to drift slowly across the room, making calculated contact with certain guests, subtly signaling my composure and strength. The small but meaningful gesture sent ripples through the audience. The woman who had been publicly humiliated was reclaiming her presence without a single act of aggression. By remaining measured and composed, I was turning the room itself into a participant in my strategy, using social perception and the psychology of observation as tools of retaliation. Juliet's overconfidence, once her greatest strength, was now an opening I could exploit, and each second that passed strengthened my resolve to act strategically rather than impulsively. Finally, I took one more subtle step, closing the physical distance in the room without appearing confrontational. Each movement was slow, deliberate, and intentional, a silent signal of readiness and calm authority. Juliet's composure wavered further, though she attempted to mask it with a practiced smile. The tension in the room intensified as the guests recognized the unspoken battle unfolding before them. It was no longer simply about the apartment keys. It had become a complex psychological duel, a test of patience, composure, and strategic intelligence. My first moves of retaliation, subtle though they were, had begun to shift the narrative. The audience's perception had changed, Juliet's confidence had begun to crack, and the stage was set for the next escalation, one that would eventually redefine the balance of power and allow me to reclaim authority, dignity, and control.
By the time the room had absorbed the subtle psychological shifts of the previous moments, I knew it was time to move from strategy to action. The patience and composure I had maintained were not signs of submission. They were the foundation upon which my retaliation would be built. Juliet, still radiating outward confidence, was increasingly unsettled beneath the surface. Her earlier assumption that the audience would align with her dominance had begun to crumble. Guests who had been hesitant moments ago now leaned in, curious, perceptive, and increasingly aware that something profound was unfolding. This awareness worked in my favor. In any confrontation, perception can be as powerful as action, and I now intended to leverage both simultaneously. Every step, every glance, and every measured phrase would work to slowly unbalance Juliet and subtly shift the power dynamics in the room. I moved closer to her, deliberately, but without aggression, ensuring my actions were calm and calculated. Each motion was intentional. A slight adjustment of my stance, a controlled lift of my hand to tuck a stray strand of hair behind my ear, a slow and deliberate breath. These small gestures conveyed calm confidence while simultaneously signaling that I was ready, aware, and not intimidated. Juliet noticed. Her eyes flickered, betraying uncertainty for the first time, and she attempted to regain her composure with a forced smile. Yet the subtle unease was there, almost imperceptible to most, but crystal clear to someone who had spent a lifetime observing human behavior. In that instant, I realized the first turning point had arrived. Juliet's perception of control was no longer absolute, and the audience was starting to sense that the narrative had shifted. The balance of power, once assumed to be hers, was now delicately contested. I decided that the next move had to combine subtle public assertion with the threat of consequence, an approach that would communicate strength without triggering overt confrontation. I addressed her directly, my tone calm but unyielding. Juliet, I respect your ambition and your desire to create a new life with Ethan, but entitlement does not replace respect. Taking something that belongs to me is not a negotiation, it is a violation. The words were deliberate, chosen to resonate with both her and the room. The audience, attuned to the unfolding drama, sensed the firmness behind the statement. Some shifted in their seats, leaning forward slightly, while others exchanged subtle glances, realizing that the woman they had assumed to be a passive victim was in fact orchestrating a quiet but undeniable assertion of authority. Juliet's reaction was instantaneous, though almost imperceptible. Her poised expression faltered briefly, a tiny flash of irritation crossing her features before she attempted to smooth it away. The calculated control she had relied upon for months, or years was beginning to erode under the pressure of composure paired with strategic defiance. The subtle crack in her facade was the signal I had been waiting for, the opening to escalate the confrontation carefully while maintaining the appearance of dignity. The first active move of retaliation was not a dramatic gesture, but a measured demonstration that I would not be dominated, belittled, or coerced. Each element of my behavior, the calm posture, the deliberate eye contact, the controlled voice, was carefully calibrated to maximize psychological impact while avoiding the trap of emotional reactivity. The guests, fully engaged in the tension now thick in the ballroom, became inadvertent participants in the unfolding drama. Their reactions, whether whispered comments, settled nods, or shifting posture, reinforced the narrative I was constructing. In moments like these, an audience's perception can amplify power, lending credibility and momentum to strategic actions. Juliet had counted on their support to maintain her dominance, yet their shifting attention and subtle recognition of my strength were undermining her control. Even my son Ethan seemed to sense the change. While he remained outwardly motionless, the slight flicker in his gaze, the micro expressions of surprise and reconsideration indicated that my strategy was beginning to influence him psychologically. The seeds of doubt were planted, and the turning point was gathering force. I allowed a moment of silence to hang in the room, letting the weight of my presence settle in. Silence can be a formidable weapon in psychological confrontation. It forces others to confront the tension and reflect on their assumptions. Juliet, unnerved by the pause and aware of the audience's shifting perception, attempted to regain control. "Aurora, you're overreacting. This is simply practical," she said, her voice slightly tighter than intended. The small strain in her tone, though easily overlooked by most, confirmed that my subtle tactics were working. The calculated combination of calm defiance, precise speech, and controlled body language was beginning to destabilize her, sowing uncertainty where there once had been arrogance. This was a pivotal moment. The first active retaliation had not only disrupted her psychological dominance, but also signaled to the audience and my son that I was a force capable of asserting authority and demanding respect. With the turning point established, I knew that my next steps had to reinforce the perception of control while preparing for more decisive actions later. I took another deliberate step closer, maintaining measured composure and locking eyes with Juliet, letting the tension between us convey authority without the need for raised voices or physical confrontation. The room, now fully attuned to the unfolding drama, seemed to hold its collective breath. Every whisper, every sideways glance, and every subtle adjustment of posture contributed to the mounting suspense. The narrative was evolving. The woman who had been publicly humiliated was now quietly but undeniably reclaiming power. Each strategic move, while seeming minor, was a deliberate chess piece placed to set up the next phase of the confrontation, the next twist that would eventually force Juliet and everyone watching to recognize that underestimation can be dangerous. I knew that in psychological warfare, timing is as critical as the actions themselves. By pacing my retaliation, I allowed the audience to perceive the shift gradually, maximizing its impact while preserving the appearance of composure and dignity. Juliet's attempts to assert dominance were now increasingly reactive, a clear indication that the balance of power was tilting. Each subtle flicker of uncertainty in her expression was an opportunity. Each moment of hesitation, a doorway for strategic escalation. By combining patience, observation, and calculated assertion, I had transformed the humiliation I suffered moments ago into a platform for control and influence. The first active moves of retaliation had not yet concluded, but the turning points were unmistakable. The audience's perception had shifted, Juliet's dominance had cracked, and the stage was set for the unfolding drama to move into the next phase of strategic confrontation. By now, the room had become an arena of tension and subtle power dynamics, every guest acutely aware that something significant was unfolding. The initial humiliation of the slap had long since transformed into a charged moment of anticipation, where perception and psychological strategy held as much weight as physical action. Juliet, once radiantly confident and assured in her dominance, now showed subtle cracks under the weight of scrutiny and the quiet force I had begun to project. Each micro-expression of hesitation, each flicker of doubt, betrayed that she was realizing her carefully constructed narrative of authority was no longer unchallenged. The shift was not overt. It was a slow burn, a rising undercurrent of tension that no one could fully ignore. In these moments, I understood that true retaliation is rarely about immediate spectacle. It is about calculated escalation, forcing your opponent to confront uncertainty while carefully guiding the audience to witness your power. I took deliberate steps across the ballroom, maintaining a calm composure that contrasted sharply with the slight tension emanating from Juliet. Each movement was slow, controlled, and intentional, an outward signal of authority and internal resilience. My son, Ethan, remained frozen in the background, but I could sense his internal struggle intensifying as he processed the subtle yet undeniable shift in dynamics. The guests, previously curious or uncomfortable, now leaned forward, drawn into the psychological interplay. Their perception was critical. Public opinion in a room like this amplifies psychological power, and I was fully aware that every glance, every whisper, and every subtle nod reinforced the unfolding narrative. The subtle escalation was as much about the audience as it was about Juliet. By controlling how they perceived the situation, I could indirectly influence the primary adversary, turning social awareness into a weapon. Speaking softly but firmly, I began to articulate the foundation of my stance, not as an emotional outburst, but as a measured declaration. Juliet, your ambition and desire to start a new life are understandable, but ambition does not grant entitlement. What belongs to me cannot be taken lightly. Respect, patience, and integrity are not optional. They are non-negotiable. The deliberate cadence of my words, combined with a calm yet authoritative tone, drew attention. Guests shifted slightly in their seats, sensing that my composure carried weight far beyond my apparent social standing. Even the subtle tension in Juliet's posture signaled that she realized her first tactics were no longer effective. This was the next critical turning point, the moment where a carefully executed psychological escalation transforms perception and begins to dictate the narrative of power. Juliet attempted to regain dominance, smoothing her wedding gown with forced elegance. "Juliet, please, it's just an apartment. We're only trying to make life easier for everyone," she said, her voice now slightly clipped, betraying the tension beneath her composed surface. Her reliance on surface-level arguments and appearances was being undermined by the quiet authority I projected. Every subtle hesitation she displayed reinforced the shifting balance, demonstrating that overconfidence and aggression are vulnerable when met with patience and strategic defiance. The first subtle cracks had become visible fractures, small yet sufficient to indicate the beginning of the reversal. Each micro-expression, tightened lips, slight flicker of eye contact, a momentary pause, was a testament to the effectiveness of carefully orchestrated psychological pressure. I advanced another measured step, closing just enough distance to maintain personal presence without threatening physical confrontation. The proximity was deliberate, close enough to assert presence, far enough to preserve composure. My eyes locked onto Juliet's, unwavering, silently communicating that the previous display of audacity, her slap and demand, would not dictate the narrative. At the same time, I allowed my gaze to sweep across the audience, reinforcing my calm authority to every guest. Their awareness, subtle yet palpable, created an environment in which Juliet's confidence could no longer operate unchecked. Social perception, audience awareness, and deliberate composure became intertwined tools, amplifying the psychological impact of every subsequent action. This stage of escalation was as much about environment manipulation as it was about personal agency.
a demonstration of power through strategy rather than aggression. I then subtly introduce a measure of unpredictability to further destabilize Juliet's composure. A slight, deliberate smile, a measured pause before speaking again, and a calm, controlled step back created the impression of internal mastery and the suggestion that I had deeper reserves of strategy at my disposal. Juliet, despite her outward composure, responded with visible tension. Her attempts to dominate through audacity alone were insufficient. She now faced a protagonist who combined psychological insight, social awareness, and patient calculation. The tension in the ballroom increased, a palpable current that heightened engagement and anticipation. Guests could feel the shifting dynamics, their collective awareness amplifying the psychological impact of my actions, creating a fertile ground for further strategic escalation. The audience's reactions played directly into my strategy. Some whispered, their tones shifting from kitty to curiosity. Others exchanged discreet glances, recognizing that the narrative was evolving. The social optics, once tilted in Juliet's favor, were now gradually recalibrating. Even subtle acknowledgments of my composure, slight nods, attentive posture, the leaning forward of heads, reinforced the sense of authority I projected. Each incremental gesture and carefully measured word compounded the effect of the first active moves of retaliation, setting the stage for the subsequent phase where strategic confrontation would escalate further, ultimately leading toward the climax of power reversal. I could sense the next pivotal moment approaching, where subtlety would give way to decisive strategy. The guests, fully engaged, the micro-expressions of Juliet, and the internal tension of my son all converged into a critical intersection of social perception and psychological pressure. Every action, every carefully measured phrase, and every strategic glance had contributed to positioning me for the upcoming moves. The ballroom, once a scene of public humiliation, had transformed into a theater of control, influence, and anticipation. My strategic escalation had shifted the psychological dynamics, setting the conditions for a reversal of power that was as inevitable as it was dramatic. By the end of these measured steps, I knew the stage was fully set. Juliet's aura of unchallenged dominance had weakened, her micro-expressions betrayed tension, and the audience's perception had shifted. Every move I had made, calculated, deliberate, and patient, was preparing for the next phase of confrontation, a decisive maneuver that would begin to reclaim the dignity, authority, and control that had been publicly challenged. The first active steps had been executed flawlessly, the turning points were now clearly established, and the next escalation would push the story toward the dramatic climax, where public humiliation, psychological insight, and strategic patience would converge into a resolution that no one in the room would forget.
The tension in the ballroom had reached a nearly tangible peak. Every guest's attention was fixed, breaths caught, whispers hushed, and eyes tracking every subtle movement, every expression, every flicker of emotion between Juliet and me. The humiliation of the earlier slap, which had seemed so powerful, was now transformed into a catalyst for a far greater display of composure, strategy, and authority. Juliet, radiant yet increasingly uneasy, continued to maintain a forced smile, but the cracks in her confidence were now undeniable. Her previously unchallenged dominance had been undermined step by step, from subtle psychological maneuvers to carefully executed strategic escalation. The room itself had become an unwitting participant, amplifying the effect of each calculated move. Social perception, as I had anticipated, was now firmly on my side. The collective awareness of my strength and composure had shifted the narrative completely, making it clear that the balance of power had moved irrevocably. I began the final phase of my strategy with a calm, measured tone that carried authority without aggression. Juliet, this apartment, like every aspect of my life, has been earned through decades of hard work, discipline, and careful management. It is not simply a space. It represents my independence, my dignity, and my legacy. Demanding it, attempting to take it, or publicly humiliating me to obtain it will not succeed. My words landed in the room like a resonant bell, steady, deliberate, and unshakable. Every guest, some shocked, some intrigued, absorbed the statement, sensing both the gravity of the words and the unyielding composure behind them. Even Ethan, previously frozen in confusion and loyalty, now began to shift subtly, his gaze flickering with realization, perhaps for the first time recognizing the true depth of his mother's strength. In moments like these, authority is measured not by loud confrontation, but by unassailable confidence, by the ability to project mastery without raising one's voice. Juliet's reaction was immediate but insufficient to reclaim control. She attempted to respond, smoothing her gown, lifting her chin, and projecting composure. Aurora, you're overreacting. This is just a matter of practicality. We only want what's reasonable. But the strain in her voice was unmistakable. Every hesitation, every flicker of irritation, every imperceptible tightening of her hands revealed the success of my subtle psychological manipulations. By remaining calm and deliberate, I had forced her into reaction, undermining her perceived advantage. The audience, now fully engaged, sensed the tension, the reversal, and the quiet yet undeniable assertion of power. The stage was set not for another moment of humiliation, but for a decisive and irreversible reclamation of authority. I took a deliberate step forward, ensuring that my presence occupied the room fully, without a hint of aggression. Every movement was controlled, measured, and intentional, sending the silent message that I was unshaken, unyielding, and fully in control. My eyes locked onto Juliet's with unwavering focus, silently communicating that the power she had assumed through audacity and manipulation was no longer hers. At the same time, my gaze swept across the audience, letting every guest feel the quiet intensity of my presence. Their attention, which had once amplified her dominance, now reinforced mine. In social dynamics, perception is often as powerful as action, and the subtle but unmistakable shift in the audience's attention intensified the psychological pressure on Juliet. Then, with deliberate calm, I invoked the final component of my strategy, the demonstration of preparation and consequence. Juliet, if you wish to challenge my autonomy, there are consequences you may not have anticipated. The decisions you make in haste and arrogance will not only affect your perception, but your credibility, your respect in this room, and ultimately the relationships you value most. The phrasing was careful, measured, and strategic. By implying consequences without aggression, I conveyed authority and control while maintaining moral high ground. The room absorbed this, the weight of my words resonating like ripples across still water. Every guest, sensing both the intelligence and composure behind my assertion, shifted subtly in perception, further isolating Juliet in her audacious demand. Juliet's facade began to fracture fully at this point. The forced composure she had maintained for months, her polished confidence, her carefully curated demeanor, was no longer sufficient to withstand the layered psychological strategy, the controlled escalation, and the shifting social perception surrounding her. She adjusted her posture, attempted to regain her smile, and repeated her request in slightly quieter tones, revealing her growing uncertainty. "Aurora, we just need the apartment." But the energy in the room had shifted irrevocably. The subtle hesitation, the repeated request, the slight stammer in her words, all of it indicated that the previously unchallenged aggressor had become reactive, forced into a position of vulnerability by patient, deliberate, and strategic psychological assertion. I allowed a quiet pause to linger, letting the tension amplify, letting the audience fully comprehend the reversal that had taken place. Silence can be one of the most formidable tools of power. It forces reflection, encourages doubt, and amplifies the weight of presence. Juliet, sensing the cumulative force of observation, strategy, and audience perception, began to visibly falter. The power she had sought to exert through audacity, aggression, and social manipulation was now crumbling under the pressure of composure, intelligence, and carefully orchestrated psychological dominance. My calm became a weapon, my patience a shield, and the room itself a medium through which authority and respect were realigned. Finally, I concluded my public assertion with a deliberate, unwavering declaration. Juliet, respect, dignity, and boundaries are not optional. This apartment is not simply a physical space. It is a symbol of a life lived with integrity and resilience. No amount of audacity, manipulation, or public performance can override that. It is not for sale and it is not for negotiation. I am Aurora Hughes, and I will not be disrespected or undermined in my own home. Each word landed with the weights of inevitability, the cadence slow and deliberate, commanding attention without the need for aggression. The guests, fully absorbed, understood the totality of the power reversal. Juliet's eyes widened, her composure finally cracking, revealing frustration, disbelief, and dawning realization. The narrative had shifted completely, the audience now recognizing my authority, and the previously humiliated woman had emerged fully in control. The culmination of years of careful observation, patience, strategic escalation, and psychological insight had reached its apex. Juliet, once the aggressor, now stood vulnerable, uncertain, and reactive, while I commanded both the room and the moral high ground. The slap, the demand for keys, and the public humiliation had become the catalyst for a complete reversal of power. Ethan, finally lifting his gaze fully, registered the undeniable reality. His mother, long underestimated, was the orchestrator of authority and control. The climax was complete. Every moment of humiliation had been transformed into a carefully managed, strategic assertion of power, respect, and dignity. As the audience processed the shift, some whispered in awe, others in disbelief, but all understood the new reality. Composure, patience, and strategic insight had triumphed over audacity and aggression. The once dominant daughter-in-law had been quietly, completely, and irrevocably disarmed. The narrative of humiliation had inverted into a story of respect, authority, and victorious strategy, leaving a lasting impression on everyone present. In the end, true power had not been displayed through aggression or spectacle, but through calculated patience, psychological mastery, and the unwavering assertion of dignity. A lesson that would resonate far beyond the walls of that ballroom.